What I'm going to talk about in this video recalls the kind of injustice that black people faced during a time period when the rule of law abandoned black people. This story represents what justice was and was not for black people. It's a really horrific story, and it's one that should not be forgotten. I believe that some want to turn the page on what was done to black people, to forget about the atrocities that we face, to ignore the pain that we suffer, and to act as if we have nothing to complain about, and that pain and trauma does not affect us today. I do not hold that view. I believe that the stories and experiences of black people must be told, even the painful and brutal ones. This story is just one of thousands. I want to give you some historical context first before I get into the story. You're going to need this historical context to fully understand and appreciate the time period which I'm asking you to go back to when you listen to this story. So give me a few moments while I break this down for you, and then I'll get into what happened to the black man I'm going to tell you about. The Red Summer of 1919 was a period of intense racial violence. Black Americans, including many black soldiers, exercised their right to defend themselves. The end of World War I brought about a significant shift in the mindset of black soldiers who had fought bravely for freedom and democracy abroad. Even though they fought bravely, when they returned home, they were met with unchanged racial prejudice against them. Their assertiveness was met with fierce resistance from a society that did not care about their bravery or their sacrifice for freedom abroad. This period also saw the first great migration of black people moving from the South to the North and the Midwest for better economic opportunities. Black people were also escaping racial terror in the South. All of this intensified competition for jobs and housing, increased racial tension all across the country. The combination of black people beginning to assert themselves in the post-war era and white workers suffering in a sluggish economy created the fire necessary to spark the Red Summer of 1919. Violence began to erupt in cities all across the country. In Washington, D.C., from July 19th through July 22nd, rumors of black men violating white women ignited a powder keg. White military servicemen launched violent attacks on black neighborhoods, leaving several people dead. In Chicago, whites drowned the black teen named Eugene Williams by throwing rocks at him after his raft drifted into the white side of the beach in Lake Michigan. The incident sparked a week-long race riot that left 38 people dead. Elaine, Arkansas witnessed one of the deadliest incidents from September 30th to October 1st. Black sharecroppers who were organizing for better wages and working conditions faced the wrath of white mobs. The situation escalated rapidly, with federal troops having to be called in. However, instead of restoring peace, these troops joined the white mobs in a massacre that resulted in the deaths of over 200 black people. Violence also spread to other cities all across the country, like Charleston, South Carolina, and Longview, Texas, and Omaha, Nebraska, and Knoxville, Tennessee. It was what happened in Knoxville that set the stage for the story that I'm going to tell you about, because that incident was more than just a riot. Maurice Mays was born on May 8, 1887 to Ella Walker. His mother was a biracial woman who worked as the maid of a prominent white politician and banker named John McMillan. His father would later on become the mayor of Knoxville, Tennessee. At 6 months old, Maurice became the foster child of William and Frances Mays. His birth father, John McMillan, continued to support Maurice. When Maurice was 17 years old, he got into trouble. A fight broke out during a crap game, and Maurice and the police tried to break it up. Maurice ended up firing at a man named John Boyd. He was convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison, but almost immediately after he was convicted, Governor John Cox, he pardoned Maurice. The judge and all 12 juries in Maurice's case sent letters to the governor on Maurice's behalf. This was seen to support his claim that he fired in self-defense and he was innocent of that crime. In 1917, Maurice married Mattie Douglas, but the marriage did not last long. They soon separated and Mattie moved up north. Maurice was a ladies' man, and he was known for associating with a lot of women, both black and white women, and this was not liked by a lot of people, especially white people. Maurice owned and ran a popular establishment in Knoxville called the Strollers Cafe. It was a place where some of everything happened. Because of all of this, Maurice was hated by a Knoxville police officer named Andy White. Andy White would try to arrest Maurice's patrons, and Maurice would often interfere, only increasing White's hatred for Maurice. Bertie Lindsay moved to Knoxville from Virginia in 1915. That same year, she met Daniel Lindsay, a 21-year-old carpenter. They married in 1916 and bought a home in Knoxville. In late May of 1919, Daniel left Knoxville for Ohio for a job. Bertie stayed behind. Her 21-year-old cousin Ora Smith moved in with her. Late on August 29, 1919, Bertie and Ora were asleep in a double bed in the front room when someone entered. Both women were awakened. Ora saw a man with a flashlight in one hand and a weapon in the other. When Bertie tried to run for the door, the intruder fired at her, taking her life. Ora said that the intruder then came and touched her private area, and she convinced him to take Bertie's purse and leave the home. Officer Andy White was a few blocks away when this happened, and when he heard that it involved a white woman, he immediately said that he knew that it was Maurice Mays that was responsible for committing this crime. White came to the scene and questioned Ora. She said that it was a black man that broke in. It's believed that White may have coerced her to say this. There was absolutely nothing linking 31-year-old Maurice Mays to this crime. On the day of the incident, Maurice rented a horse and buggy. He went into the black community in East Knoxville and handed out campaign cards for his biological father, Mayor John McMillan. That night, he returned the card and he continued to campaign for his father on foot in the downtown area. He then rode around with a friend in his car until about 12:30 a.m. before he walked back to his house. Maurice had a rock-solid alibi. Andy White and other officers first went to the home of William Mays, Maurice's foster father. When they learned that Maurice had his own home a few blocks away, they went there. At the time, Maurice was asleep. Maurice let White and the officers in. White asked to see Maurice's weapon. He picked it up and sniffed it to see if he could smell an odor that would indicate that it had been fired. He smelled no odor. There was no flashlight in Maurice's home. They questioned Maurice and then, without telling him the reason why they were there, they told Maurice to get dressed and to come with them. They put Maurice in their car and they drove him a few houses away to the crime scene. They then made him stand under a streetlight with 3 policemen. Andy White went to get Ora Smith. She identified Maurice as her attacker. Maurice was then taken to the police station and booked for committing this crime. Rumors started to spread that the crime was worse than what it was. The rumor was that Maurice had robbed and violated Birdie. As the rumor spread, anger built up and the call for revenge became strong. A mob of white men formed and went to the jail and demanded that Maurice be handed over to them. The police told the mob that Maurice was not there. In fact, Maurice had been disguised as a woman and taken to Chattanooga for his safety. Fights began to break out and shots were fired. The National Guard had to be called in to help the police keep peace, but this only angered the mob more. The mob then tore down a pole and then used it as a battering ram to knock down the door of the jail. They then freed all the white prisoners and none of the black prisoners. They also took large amounts of liquor and all the weapons and ammo that they could carry. The riot became so bad that Governor Albert Roberts had to send more national troops in and he declared martial law. In all, over 1,000 National Guardsmen and 500 police officers responded to the riot. But this was still not enough. Soon the mob turned its attention to the black section of Knoxville. They destroyed homes and property. Before it was all over, it's believed that 25 to 30 men died. Even though the white mob was the cause of all of this, it was the black people who were treated as if they were the perpetrators. Black people were harassed by the military forces. Their homes were searched and curfews were put on black people, while the white people in Knoxville were treated as if they had done nothing wrong at all. The news media justified the mob's actions because of what they said Maurice had done to Birdie Lindsay. Maurice maintained his innocence from the very beginning, but the forces of injustice moved quickly to get the outcome that they wanted. Maurice was indicted by a grand jury 4 days after this incident. 1 month later, on October 1st, 1919, Maurice's trial began in Knox County Criminal Court. Judge T.A.R. Nelson presided over the case. 12 white men were chosen for the jury. Maurice's case was very high profile, so much so that Governor Roberts appointed former Knoxville Mayor S.G. Heiskell to prosecute Maurice along with 2 other prominent attorneys. Maurice had 5 attorneys, including 2 of Knoxville's 3 black attorneys at the time, William Yardley, who was the first black person to run for governor and the first black person to argue a case before the Tennessee Supreme Court, and attorney John W. Huff. Maurice had very capable lawyers, and it's believed that Maurice's father, Mayor John McMillan, he arranged for Maurice's defense. At trial, the prosecution called 15 witnesses. The most important witnesses to testify were Ora Smith and Andy White. Ora said that she awoke and saw a black man and he attacked them. Andy White testified that he only became suspicious of Maurice after talking with Ora and getting a description of the attacker from her. He claimed that only then did he ask for permission to talk to and search Maurice. He said that he and 2 other officers went to Maurice's home and they smelled smoke powder on Maurice's weapon that made them believe that it had been recently fired. The prosecution threw everything they had at Maurice. They even tried to get the judge to allow them to tell the jury that Maurice was known to run after white women. And they also wanted to show the jury photos of white women that they claimed that Maurice had in his possession. The judge denied their request. There was no physical evidence tying Maurice to this crime. His weapon was not identified as being used in the crime. The round extracted from Birdie Lindsay's body did not match Maurice's weapon, and no fingerprints were presented at trial. And there was no motive as to why Maurice Mays would do this to Birdie Lindsay. Maurice testified in his own defense. He told the jury that he'd been campaigning on behalf of the mayor that day, and after that, he was socializing with black friends. He said that he got home around 12:30 a.m. and he went to sleep. He said the next thing he knew, the police were at his door. He let them in and they started questioning him, and they demanded to see his weapon. And then they told Maurice to get dressed and to follow them. After that, he said he saw Ora Smith with Officer Andy White and she was saying that he was the one that attacked them. Maurice's attorneys were prevented from calling 3 witnesses who were white women, who were going to testify that they too had been attacked by someone the same way that Birdie Lindsay had been after Maurice had been arrested and he was in jail. The judge said no to this request. Maurice's attorneys called over 20 witnesses to support his defense. One of the witnesses they called was a white police officer named Dave Sanders, who said that he examined the weapon at the police station and he said that he did not smell any odor coming from it. He also said that he conducted an experiment with a flashlight in a dark room and that the person holding the light could not be seen the way Ora Smith said she saw the attacker. The most important witness that Mays' attorneys called was a man named James Smith. He was a black driver of the police wagon. He worked for the police department for 12 years. He said that on the way to Bertie Lindsay's home, he heard Andy White say that Maurice was the one who was responsible for the crime. He said that White hated Maurice and often cursed him and called Maurice racial slurs. After hearing all the evidence that proved that Maurice was not guilty of this crime, the jury took less than 20 minutes to find Maurice guilty. The judge then sentenced Maurice to death. 2 weeks later, Maurice's attorneys moved for a new trial. His attorneys claimed that Maurice was prevented from getting a fair trial because of the racially charged atmosphere that was present in the community. They also argued that the judge had made a mistake in instructing the jury and sentencing Maurice to death. Maurice's attorneys appealed his conviction. The appeal postponed his execution date. In January of 1920, the Tennessee Supreme Court reversed Maurice's conviction on a technicality. At the time, there was a change in Tennessee law that required the jury to impose the death sentence and not the judge. Maurice was tried again on April 18, 1921. The same prosecution and defense attorneys came back for the case, and the outcome was the same again. Maurice was found guilty and sentenced to die by electrocution. His attorneys appealed once more, but the appeal was denied. By this time, Tennessee had elected a new governor, Alfred Taylor. After the state Supreme Court upheld Maurice's conviction, Taylor received a flood of communications and letters and telegrams about the case. Some urged immediate execution, while some citizens from all walks of life supported Maurice's innocence and called for reconsideration and reprieve. In response, Taylor granted a 90-day execution delay until March 15, 1922, to allow for the examination of new evidence. Finally, on March 14th, Governor Taylor said that he saw no evidence that would indicate that Maurice was wrongly convicted. Maurice's foster father, William Mays, went to the death house at the state penitentiary to see Maurice. He watched Maurice be baptized by 2 black ministers. Maurice told his father once more that he was innocent of this crime. Maurice had also written to Ora Smith and he begged her to admit that she was wrong. It was her word alone that had convicted Maurice, but she did not recant her identification. On March 15, 1922, at 6:12 a.m., the first electric shock was sent into Maurice Mays' body. This went on for 4 minutes until he was finally dead. His last words were him saying once more that he was innocent, and he also said that he was executed because of politics and politicians not wanting to lose votes. William Mays took his son's body back to Knoxville for his funeral. 2,000 of the city's 12,000 black population attended Maurice's open casket funeral. For years after Maurice's execution, similar attacks continued on women in Knoxville. By the end of 1924, 32 similar attacks had gone unsolved, with 8 women losing their lives in the same way Bertie Lindsay lost hers. But something even more strange happened in 1927. In August of 1927, a 28-year-old white woman named Sadie Mendel walked into a Northern Virginia police station and said that she wanted to confess to the crime of taking Bertie Lindsay's life. She said that Bertie had been having an affair with her husband and she sought revenge. She said that she put on men's clothing, blackened her face, and came to the Lindsay's home and fired at Bertie. She said that this had troubled her ever since and that's why she wanted to confess. Knoxville PD dismissed her and discredited her entire story. But that's not even the most shocking part. 1 year after that, in 1925, a man named William Sheffey was arrested in Knoxville for attacking several women the same way that Bertie Lindsay was. He was tried 3 times and never convicted. Whether Sadie Mendel or William Sheffey did it or not, we'll never know, but what we do know is that Maurice Mays was wrongly convicted. His crime was being black and targeted by a police officer who did not like the fact that Maurice associated with white women. In the early 20th century, the American South began to see a shift in how it carried out racial violence. Lynch mobs that carried out brutal public executions without trial were replaced with legal lynchings. Quick and unjust racially biased trials replaced mob violence with state-sanctioned executions. Southern states began to create a monopoly on the use of force against black people, and that's exactly what happened to Maurice Mays. It was clear that Maurice was innocent of this crime from the very beginning, but it did not matter. The weight of injustice and oppression was too strong to overcome fairness, equality, and justice. And in many ways, the same still exists today. I want to know your thoughts on this story. Had you ever heard of Maurice Mays, and how did it make you feel learning all that he went through? Leave me a comment down below and let me know your thoughts.